So let's now talk about the Scrum practices that are used in Scrum teams. The first one is called a sprint. So Scrum divides the project into iterations or sprints of fixed length. The length of the sprint is usually 2 to 4 weeks. So for example, I have a project which has a timeline of 3 months. In this case, I can divide this project into, for example, 3 iterations or 6 iterations. And at the end of each iteration or sprint, I have a product that I can show to the customer and he can give me feedback about it. Then we have something that's called the product increment. So at the end of each sprint, we should have a potentially releasable or shippable product, which is called an increment. So like we see here, we build something, we measure its quality and get feedback from the customer. We learn new things and then build a new functionality or a new build. This new build is called a product increment. Like we said in the agile principles, working software is the primary measure of progress. So the most important thing is to have a working software that the customer can give us feedback about its quality. Then we have the product backlog. Like we saw earlier, the product owner manages a prioritized list of planned product items, and the product backlog evolves from one sprint to another, which is called backlog refinement. So for example, like we saw, we wrote a group of user stories, then we added some of them to the first sprint. At the end of the sprint, we get feedback from the customer. Based on this feedback, we begin to review our product backlog. We edit the user stories, we change in their acceptance criteria. We might also change the priority of the user stories, and this is called backlog refinement. Then we have sprint backlog. So the sprint backlog are the issues or the user stories that are chosen for development in this sprint. At the start of each sprint, the Scrum team selects a set of highest priority items from the product backlog. So, like we said, the product backlog is written mainly by the product owner. But the product owner is not the person who decides which user stories will be added to the sprint backlog. No, this is the whole team. So like we see here, for example, we have a product backlog, then we have release number 1, then from release 1, we have sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3, until sprint 4, and so on. In some projects, we don't have a release in the middle. We just go from product backlog to sprint backlog. It depends on the size of the project. Then we have definition of done. So like we saw earlier in the user story, we have a definition of done of the user story. Those are the tasks that when they are implemented, we can say that this user story is ready for deployment. The same with the sprint. For each sprint, we should have a definition of done. What are the tasks that must be finished in order for this sprint to reach its goal? Another important definition is time boxing. So inside your sprint, you should only add the tasks that you expect to finish within this sprint. If you are expecting that you cannot finish a task, then you should move it back to the product backlog. So how do we do time boxing? We do it using something that's called a planning poker at the beginning of the sprint. So the planning poker is an activity in which we give some points to each user story. We say, okay, this user story, is it complicated? Will it need a huge amount of testing or not? And so on. Based on this, we give this user story a number. And this number follows the Fibonacci sequence. So let's open Google and write planning poker. Images. So like you see here, for example, this is the planning poker. We have the product owner, the Scrum Master, the developer, the tester, all of them gather together at the beginning of the sprint, at the sprint planning meeting. They begin to read the user story with its acceptance criteria and its risks, and each one of them separately chooses a number. This number represents the complexity of this user story and the time that it will require to be implemented. If they all agree on the same number, then this is the estimate of this user story. If they don't agree, in this case, each one of them begins to explain his point of view and they try to reach a number that all of them accepts. The estimate points of the user stories mostly follow the Fibonacci sequence. So like we see here, the smallest user story has an estimate of 1. This is like, for example, contact us page. Contact us page should have an estimate of 1. Then the numbers follow Fibonacci sequence. We have 2, then 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 8 is 13, 8 plus 13 is 20, and so on. The best way in estimating the user story points is to stop at 20. If the user story requires more than 20 points, we can call it an epic, like we said. An epic is a large user story. So if the user story requires 40 points, this is an epic. We create an epic and begin to divide it into smaller user stories. Some people prefer this way of estimation, which follows the Fibonacci sequence and story points, and other teams prefer to estimate tasks only using time. So this user story requires 1 hour, 2 hours, and so on without using Fibonacci sequence. Both of the ways is correct. The last concept in Scrum is transparency. The development team should report and update the sprint status on a daily basis at a meeting that's called the daily Scrum. So in Scrum we have a daily Scrum meeting. It might also be called daily stand-up meeting because everyone is standing up for like 5 minutes and each one of the team members begins to explain what he did yesterday, what he is going to do today, and if he has any problems within that block his work.